Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is Crisis on Infinite Earths. Now, this is a 12-issue comic book series from DC Comics, which was written by Marv Wolfman and illustrated by George Pérez, and this was published between the years 1985 and 1986. Now, the majority of DC's content takes place in the same continuity, but at a certain point DC established the concept of a multiverse, this idea that there are all these different parallel universes, each universe with its own version of planet Earth. Now, the reason they did this was to explain certain continuity errors or certain contradictions, where they would say, oh, these stories were taking place on this version of Earth, while these other stories were taking place on another version of Earth. Now, I am fascinated by the whole multiverse theory, and personally, I think it's a brilliant way to tie together stories that seem unconnected. Like, Stephen King does that with his Dark Tower novels, where all of his other stories are tied in with the multiverse that he established in that series. But at a certain point in the mid-80s, DC felt that the whole multiverse concept would be too confusing for new readers, so they wanted to reboot their continuity and do away with the multiverse and set all of their stuff in one universe, but they wanted to do it in such a way where it doesn't contradict anything that came before, so they hired Marv Wolfman to do this story arc. And basically, every comic book that DC was doing at the time had to do at least one issue with tying in with this story arc. For example, Alan Moore did an issue of his run on Swamp Thing called Revelations, which tied directly in with this story. So, the plot of Crisis on Infinite Earths is, there's this cosmic event happening. Basically, there's this interdimensional rift that is literally eating its way through the multiverse, and entire parallel universes and different versions of Earth are being erased from existence. So, this godlike being called the Monitor gathers up all these heroes and villains from different universes and different time periods and brings them together to save what's left of the multiverse. And now they have to fight another godlike being called the Anti-Monitor, who comes from another dimension known as the Antimatter Universe, and the Anti-Monitor wants to destroy reality and recreate it in his image. So, all these superheroes, including two different versions of Superman, and a boy named Alexander Luthor, who is the son of the Lex Luthor of a parallel Earth, they now all have to come together to fight for existence itself. Now, Crisis on Infinite Earths was a very good story. I will say it was very convoluted, but I don't necessarily blame Marv Wolfman for that. I think that's just the nature of the kind of story that this is. Also, if you're reading this as a standalone story, you might have some problems because so much of this ties in continuity-wise with pretty much everything else that DC was doing at the time. Like, there's so many lines of dialogue in here where there's a little asterisk saying, to understand this plot point, go read this comic or that comic, and I think at the time they were doing this, they very much were writing this for followers of DC's continuity, but most people picking this up in trade paperback at a bookstore today are going to be reading this as a standalone story. And I know DC did put out a collection of all the issues of other comic book series that were tying in with this one, so it would probably be necessary to read that in order to understand everything going on in this story. But this was a very ambitious comic for the time. I mean, this was a major crossover event. And some pretty major DC Comics characters do end up dying in this story. Granted, with these kinds of characters, and with comic books in general, you know they're not gonna leave these characters dead. And the characters that do end up dying in this do end up coming back. Granted, you could argue, since the timeline does kind of get reset in this story, you could argue that it's the versions of the characters that we knew up until this point that are dying. But yeah, I recommend this if you're a fan of DC Comics, if you're a fan of superhero stuff, if you're a fan of science fiction. Now, I am doing this review as part of my series of Superman reviews, which is something I do every January, right before I do the Batman reviews. Even though this is so much more than just the Superman story, I mean, you do see two different versions of Superman in this comic. I mean, arguably, you could say that the character of Harbinger or the character of Alexander Luthor are the main protagonists. But you have everybody showing up in this comic. You also have Batman, Green Lantern, Firestorm, The Flash. Actually, The Flash has a pretty important role in this story, and his subplot is actually pretty creepy. You also have Wonder Woman, Batgirl, Supergirl. Actually, Supergirl does play a pretty major role in this story. Another character who plays a pretty major role in this story is the Spectre, who is one of DC's supernatural superheroes. He actually gets his powers from the Presence, which is the DC Universe's version of God. And some of DC's other supernatural or magical characters also play a role in this story because there is a mystical element to the Anti-Monitor where he's able to summon the shadow demons. Swamp Thing also has a brief cameo appearance in this story, and so does John Constantine. And I was actually surprised to see John Constantine in this story because at the time he was such a new character. Constantine is a character created by Alan Moore for Alan Moore's run on Swamp Thing, and this was before the character would get his own spin-off series, Hellblazer. Now, there were two sequels to this. I don't think Marv Wolfman had anything to do with the two sequels, but there was Infinite Crisis and Final Crisis. And recently, this comic was adapted for television for the whole Arrowverse. The Arrowverse is a series of TV shows that all take place in the same multiverse, like Arrow, The Flash, Supergirl, Constantine, Legends of Tomorrow. I think they even tied in the Fox show Lucifer into that multiverse. Now, I haven't watched any of those shows, but I have heard some very mixed things about what they did with the Crisis storyline. But that was my review on Crisis on Infinite Earths by Marv Wolfman, and bye.